One of the memorable and effective sound bites that Donald Trump used very effectively last year during the campaign for president was "drain the swamp." In October of last year, he tweeted one among many tweets that included this phrase, "I will make our government honest again, believe me. But first, I'm going to have to drain the swamp." So the metaphor, of course, means that in order to bring about whatever changes it is you intend to bring about, you really have to start over. As Trump used the phrase, it meant that he had to be big and bold and brave and get rid of the establishment. All of those people that pretend to be working for the American people but are actually working against them in every conceivable way. And only then, by getting rid of all of that, draining the swamp, could he make our government honest again, as he said in this tweet. So, you won't hear me say this very often, but I am going to follow Mr. Trump's lead today and start off by attempting to drain the swamp of how people usually understand the story of Adam and Eve. And I'm going to try to make the story great again. I heard a few groans there. Well, Walter Brueggemann is one of the best and most influential biblical scholars around today. Proudly, by the way, he is part of the United Church of Christ. And he says that no text in Genesis, or likely anywhere else in the Bible, has been more misunderstood than the story of Adam and Eve. So, here are six of the swamp creatures that we have to get rid of before we can understand this text very well. First, people often think that this story sets the stage for the rest of the Bible, that it is itself decisive to understanding everything that follows. It's as if this one thing didn't happen, then the rest of the Bible would barely be necessary. That's a swamp creature, I'm afraid. The truth is that the story about Adam and Eve is never again mentioned in the Old Testament. In my Bible, it's got to be about 500 pages after this story in the second and third chapters of Genesis. Never again in those 500 pages is the story of Adam and Eve mentioned. And it is mentioned in the New Testament, but even then, only in a marginal way. Now, there is a lot that we can get out of this story, but that's because it reflects similar themes to much of the rest of the Bible, not because the rest of the Bible couldn't have happened without this one central story. Second, then, the story is commonly treated as an account of the fall. I wonder if I can get 100% here. How many of you ever heard of the fall? Yeah, okay, maybe we're getting close to 100% there. Well, that's a swamp creature too. Nothing could be more remote from the story itself than this idea of one disastrous, all-consuming fall. I'm just going to throw this out there for you to reflect upon. But in general, the Old Testament does not assume the fall of humankind. We read in plenty of places in the Bible that people can follow the purposes of God in this world. There is no abstract conclusion in the Bible that people are evil, certainly not as a result of this one story, or that people are wholly sinful and certainly not because Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the forbidden tree. People do good stuff, people do bad stuff, and this is one instance of the bad stuff and the consequences that go with it. Third, people often treat this as an explanation of how evil itself came into the world. Well, if that's what the story is trying to do, it does a pretty poor job of it, because clearly whatever leads to the actions of Adam and Eve in this story is already there when the story begins. There's no general force of evil here, not represented in the serpent or in any other part of the story. The Bible really isn't interested in such an abstract explanation as why there is evil in the world. The Bible isn't concerned with the origin of evil, but rather with faithful responses to evil, effective coping with evil as we go about our life with God. Fourth, in a similar way, the story isn't also about how death came into the world. It's not about how evil came into the world, and it's not about how death came into the world. Death is part of the reality of creation from the very beginning. There's no explanation here about where it came from. Now, the story does have a lot to do with humanity's all-consuming anxiety about death, but it has little to do with why there is such a thing as death to begin with. Before they eat the fruit, Adam and Eve were already on the human journey toward death. It's just that they had reason after that to be filled with anxiety about it. Fifth, we gotta get past the connection between Adam and Eve and sin and death and sex. In spite of what seems to be shown in the entire history of the artwork of humankind, it is not such a bad thing that Adam and Eve desire each other. That desire to be in communion with each other, to be united to each other, is a direct gift from God. You'll notice that on the cover of the worship order today, I had to choose finally, after about 2 days of looking and in consulting Bromley on it as well, to have her do long and involved internet searches for me, I finally had to choose a little children's picture. Because of all the artwork in the history of humanity, this is the only image that doesn't present Adam and Eve as somehow lustfully pursuing each other with an apple right there present, turning it all into this sinister, sexy, corrupt kind of thing. It's ridiculous when you look at all the imagery. If you were paying attention to the screens before the service, those are the pictures you saw. I refused to use them on the cover of the worship order. That's not what the story is about. Their desire for each other, to be in communion with each other, is a gift from God. And then sixth, the passage also, and we had a long and involved conversation about this on Thursday at my Bible study when we talked about this passage. This passage does not establish men as naturally in charge of women. Insofar as the story reflects on the relationship of the sexes at all, its concern is with the political dynamics of power and control and autonomy. Now, the woman may end up being ruled by the man, as it says in the story, but that is clearly the result of a break from God and a break from each other, and not the way things are supposed to be. That is something we need to constantly seek to undo, not replicate in the world. So that's a lot of swamp, right? If we're going to revisit Sunday school, then we need to take some of those ideas that probably didn't come to us in third grade Sunday school, but did come to us in the sort of Sunday school of our culture, and we need to clean them out and try to start afresh with this story. But if none of that is true to the story, nor I think very helpful for us today, how are we going to make the story of Adam and Eve great again? Yeah, there goes those groans again. Well, it's complicated, right? You're laughing because you've heard me say that before, and it's true, and I will say it again. It's complicated. This is a story. And stories have depth and texture. And when the stories involve human beings with needs and wants and free will, then they especially resist easy explanation. So think of what I'm going to say now as more like a reflection than an explanation. This is more like an attempt to get inside the story rather than to nail the story down to one particular meaning. What we see in this story is that humans are created with the breath of God, and so share something of God's life. One of the things we share with God is that we are inherently social beings. It is not good for the human to be alone, God says. To be who we are intended to be, we need to be deeply in relationship with others. Although we are intimately connected to God, although the very breath of God is what animates us as human beings, still we are clearly not God. We are made from the dust of the earth, and to the dust we shall return. As this story is told, we find that our creaturely life is marked by three things. And I'm going to describe them with 3 P's, maybe make them easier to understand. As created, our lives are composed of purpose and permission and prohibition. The purpose for which God has created us in this story is clear. It's reflected in one evocative line, that God has placed the human in the garden to keep and till it. We are here to cooperate, in other words, to cooperate with God in the care of and the creation of creation itself. And we are caretakers. It does say in the earlier story of Genesis, chapter 1, that we are to have dominion over all of the creatures of creation. But that dominion must be understood in the context of this second story, where we learn that we are to keep the garden and till it. That is our purpose in life. Now, of course, it doesn't just mean we all have to be gardeners or farmers or whatever it is, right? It means that as God goes about God's purpose in this world, our purpose is to participate with God in that purpose. That's who we are And unless we are participating with God in the care of creation, in all of its physical and social and political dynamics, unless we're participating in that care of creation, we're not fulfilling who we are meant to be, what our purpose is as God's people. Now, we also then have permission. This is perhaps the greatest part of the story, the part of the story that is overlooked most often and most completely. God says to the creatures that He has created that they can eat from any tree in the garden. What an amazing gift that is. What an amazingly gracious God. God has created this world with everything in it, from bananas to papayas to kangaroos to the stars to our brains to our relationships with each other. And we can be nourished by all of that. And all of that is a gift. We have the permission to not consume it, but to enjoy it, because we have the permission from God to enjoy God's creation. And then comes the part of the story that we always focus on, the prohibition, right? Because part of the story says, you can eat of any tree in the garden, except for this one over here. And where does humanity race right to? That one over there. I could, tell you, and you could tell me all sorts of stories about the kid who says, don't cross the street, who immediately wants to cross the street. We could all think of stories, don't think about pink elephants. And now you're going to think about pink elephants. It's what humanity does, right? We go straight to the prohibition. The funny thing in the story, though, is that there is no explanation for why we do this. As I said earlier when I was trying to drain the swamp, there's no explanation for why we do this. This just is part of our created nature. God says, don't eat that tree. We want to eat from that tree. The point is not to understand how it came into the world. The point is to understand that God has placed that prohibition, that limit there for a reason beyond our knowing. That there are some limits in this world that are good for us, and we do well to respect. In the story, of course, the tree is named the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we sort of sometimes take that as a moral classification. We think, well, if Adam and Eve eat that tree, then they're going to know what good is, and they're going to know what evil is. They're going to know what bad is, and they're going to have a hard time choosing among the two, between the two. Really, in biblical language, it's better to understand the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as the tree of the knowledge of everything from A to Z. It's like all the way from good to evil. All the way from A to Z. It's the knowledge of everything. And when we long for the knowledge of everything, what we're ultimately doing is trying to control everything. When Adam and Eve eat of that fruit, they want control. The serpent tells them that you will become like God. And they say, yeah, that's what we want. But guess what? We are not God. We are God's creatures. And we need to live with the limits that God has placed upon us. And that is a blessing, not a curse. Then, of course, we violate that prohibition. we cross that limit. We try to be the people that God does not want us to be, and that boundary now becomes a threat. By using words to twist God's words, the serpent leads us into doubt and wondering, and we wonder, if we could be like God. And all of a sudden, when we consume that fruit, we find that we are separated from God. We find that we cannot live in communion with God and each other. We hide from ourselves. We create these loincloths to cover ourselves up, to hide from each other. We hide from God as God walks through the garden. That communion with God, that natural communion with God for which we were created, is broken. This isn't a simple story about human disobedience and divine displeasure. It's rather a story about the struggle that God has in responding to the facts of human life, and the struggle that humans have in responding to our own limits. But then this story comes to an end in the 3rd chapter, and what it says is that God does not give up on us. God announced the penalty would be death, but death is not what we get. We get ongoing life with God. We get ongoing life with a God who will not give up trying to draw us back into communion again. God protects us. God gives us clothing to go out into the world. God continues to gift us with God's presence. And so we can go on. So again, I don't have any one meaning for this story. I don't have any great explanation of what it means for all of our lives. But what I do know is that this is a story worth grappling with, because this is a God worth grappling with. A God who takes us as we are and insists on always and forever being in communion with us. Thanks be to God for this story. I encourage you to engage with it, to grapple with it, and to live it in communion with God each and every day. Amen.